Let's talk about the economy. Stock markets around the world have been pounded. Oil prices have fallen off a cliff. In just 1 week, 3.3 million Americans applied for unemployment, almost 5 times the record. A week later, another 6.6 million.
We had to make the impossible decision to lay off 98% of our workforce this morning.
As COVID-19 spreads, the global economy is shutting down, and it's unlike anything we've ever seen.
A recession at least as bad as during the global financial crisis or worse.
But what makes this collapse different? What will it take to recover? And are we headed for a depression? Welcome to another episode of Start Here from quarantine in my hotel room. When it comes to the economy, we've really never been here before. Not like this. Even though we have lived through some huge economic shocks. There was the Great Depression that started in 1929 and lasted a decade. Back in 2001, the 9/11 attacks also badly damaged the economy, and of course, the airline industry. The 2007 subprime mortgage crisis in the US led to a global financial crisis and triggered the Great Recession, the longest in US history. Some countries still haven't recovered. And now there's a pandemic.
The swiftness and severity of the shock to the global economy, that is absolutely unprecedented.
This financial crisis is both different and worse because first and foremost, it's a health crisis. So economists know we can't just fix the economy. That's like trying to fix your house while it's still on fire.
If we don't try to control the spread of coronavirus, then the suffering will be much bigger.
Let's take another look at the graph from our last episode. It shows a steep spike in the number of cases if we don't contain COVID-19 and the pressure that puts on hospitals. So countries right now are trying to flatten that curve by locking down and enforcing social distancing. But that has consequences. The more aggressively we try to slow the spread and save lives, the deeper the recession. So the irony is that to save the economy, you have to shut it down first. That's why economists expect a serious recession, maybe even a depression, which goes on for longer and is more severe.
What matters more than avoiding an all-out depression is protecting people's health, particularly protecting the most vulnerable, and so doing whatever we can to address the health impacts of the crisis.
For a lot of people, this really is going to be painful. For some, it already is. I'm on the lookout to speak to people who are really worried about their livelihoods because of the lockdowns. Nearly every sector of the economy is getting hit right now, but service jobs are most at risk. They require face time with customers, and everyone's being told to stay home. Look at India, where 1.3 billion people are under lockdown. 80% of the workforce are self-employed or earn a daily wage. 120 million of them are migrant workers. Many have now lost their jobs in the cities.
3 दिन से बैठे हुए हैं यहाँ पे कोई सुविधा नहीं है खाने पीने की.
In South Africa, soldiers are on patrol to make sure 57 million people stay home. The unemployment rate there before COVID-19 was already 30%.
Almost half of South Africans who are poor. The reality is that, if they don't go and work, and it could mean the difference between a meal or not.
So how can you even get your head around that kind of global unemployment and economic stagnation? You might be familiar with the law of supply and demand. Well, the coronavirus has managed to take out both. First, there was a supply shock as factories, businesses, and borders closed. That triggered a demand shock because industries don't need raw materials if they aren't producing. And the lockdowns mean people aren't buying things or can't afford to because they're not earning money. Look at China, which in today's globalized economy is the factory to the world. The coronavirus outbreak virtually shut it down.
Its production has dropped by 25% over the last 3 months. So that is a big shock to the world economy.
China is also a massive buyer on the international market. Things like raw materials, all kinds of cars, and agricultural products. So that's also had an effect.
The biggest concern is China. China was already heading for minus 1% projection on GDP this year. And once China is getting out of its own health crisis, Europe, their biggest market, isn't getting into theirs, which basically means that we are seeing a huge demand contraction in the international trade.
As the virus began to spread, those supply and demand shocks spread to other countries too. And then the markets started to panic. Stock indexes in New York, London, Tokyo all had devastating sessions several times over. In the US, the Dow lost almost 3,000 points in just one day, the most ever. So how do we fix all this? Again, economists say we need to deal with the pandemic first. But there are things that both central banks and governments are doing to ease some of the pain. The job of a central bank is to make sure there's a steady supply of money flowing through the global financial system. And in a time of crisis, they also make sure the credit markets don't freeze up. So central banks around the world have pumped trillions of dollars into the banking system to make sure banks and businesses can bounce back when this is all over. They've also cut interest rates to make loans even cheaper. The central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve System, has done something else too. It's made sure other central banks around the world can borrow enough US dollars. It's the currency the world runs on.
US dollars are to businesses what toilet paper is to households. They don't want to run out of US dollars before this crisis has passed.
But central bank heroics alone aren't enough. Governments need to step up too. World leaders have pledged hundreds of billions of dollars to help people, businesses, and the health sector battle this crisis. The British government, for example, put forward $435 billion.
That's like 15% of the United Kingdom GDP to try to get us through this crisis because it is a matter of life or death.
In the US, the federal government came up with a $2.2 trillion relief package. That's about 10% of its GDP, the largest in American history.
This will deliver urgently needed relief to our nation's families, workers, and businesses.
But not everyone is convinced those rescue packages are going to be enough.
Dr. Doom, Nouriel Roubini, the economist who called the 2008 financial crisis 2 years before it happened, he's definitely not convinced. In fact, he's warning that containment measures have not been sufficient enough and that the fiscal stimulus package is neither large enough nor has it been enacted swiftly enough to seriously mitigate the risks, not just of a recession, everybody agrees that's going to happen, but to mitigate the risks of possibly a depression.
But other countries just don't have that kind of cash, especially if they're struggling economically or dealing with conflict, famine, even other diseases. The UN forecasts that income losses in developing countries because of the coronavirus could exceed $220 billion.
The economies that will have the toughest time crawling out of it are really the poorest nations because they were in the worst position going into the crisis, and they will have the hardest time shaking off the negative effects of it.
Economists are bracing for things to get worse in the short term, but they also see this as an opportunity to fix what was broken. They have a saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
We do also have to think about sustainability, about the sustainability of our planet. And it's about the health and integrity of our ecosystems. Do we have a resilient economy? Do we have a resilient health system? Food production systems. Can we be sure that when a crisis like this happens and hits the economy, we are able to go on feeding people and keeping people healthy to stop a descent into social instability, which can very often follow from a deep and protracted depression?
Those are big questions for world leaders to answer. But right now, many of us, economists included, are looking to them to make some tough decisions to fight this pandemic and relieve the pain. A lot of people are already hurting. We don't know when we'll be back on the Start Here set, but not to worry. We're still going to be bringing you more episodes any way we can. In the meantime, our website, aljazeera.com, has all the latest on the coronavirus pandemic. I'll see you next week.